I think the Conservative Party has lost entirely its sort of unifying purpose, and I think this is a perception that the electorate shares as well. It's very hard to make sense of what the Conservative Party believes in or stands for anymore. It seems to me to have dissolved into a series of unruly factions.
Could the Conservatives disappear?
I mean, anything is possible. I think the Canadian example that we've been hearing about was obviously a reduction to 2 seats. And I think even on the absolute worst horror polls, or for example, electoral calculus, which doesn't really do, which is quite a blunt instrument, we're talking about perhaps 90, below 100. I think there's maybe one or two polls suggesting around 60. So you would expect there to be a rump of Tory MPs, whatever. I think the question is more, are they reduced to such a point that they stop being a force in politics, or a major force, and could they fall to the point that they're not the official opposition? Now, I think that most MPs worry, but they believe things will tighten a bit in an election campaign. And maybe that's a false hope, but figures in Labour also think they might, and therefore, I would probably say most MPs think they will get over 100 MPs, but it might not be much over that. I think that's the current thinking.
What's your current thinking, Andrew?
I mean, sadly, I don't think it's very likely that they're going to be wiped out entirely. I think most people would agree, as that YouGov polling suggests, an awful lot of people think they deserve it. But I think there's a sort of sense in Westminster that there's a real expectation we're heading for this massive landslide Labour majority, and the question is sort of, do the Tories get up just over 100 or just under? I tend to think that's an overly pessimistic scenario for the Tories, because the average of the polls that people look at is an average of two different clusters of voting polls. So just in the last week, we've had a couple of polls saying that Labour's lead is 23 or 24 points, and 3 polls saying it's 16 or 17. And there's a big difference in terms of the outcome, which of those is more likely to be right. And as Katie's just said, the expectation in normal times, you would expect that the lead, whatever the lead is now, that it will narrow a bit between now and the election. And the other thing which is often forgotten when we look at these huge leads and the discussion, the narrative is all about, will the Tories be wiped out? It's easy to forget how devastating Labour's defeat was under Corbyn in 2019, which means that the baseline for Labour from the last election is extremely challenging. They have to win a huge number of seats just to get a majority. They need a bigger swing than Tony Blair got in 1997 just to get a majority of one. They have to win more seats in one election to get a majority of just one than has ever been won in just one election since the war, apart from by Tony Blair in 1997. So I think we'd all bet that Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister by Christmas, probably with a fairly decent majority. But I think the disaster scenarios for the Tories are unlikely to happen.
I mean, you've lived through several of those disasters yourself, Andrew, having. You were in the SDP, and we know what happened with them. And then you worked for the Conservative Research Department. You were there for the 1997 election defeat, which, there were lots of conversations then about, will the Tories ever win again? You worked for William Hague as Director of Strategy. We know what then happened in 2001. Are we too quick to write off political parties? What is it about the Conservative Party that means that it somehow keeps surviving, despite often the best attempts of the people leading it?
I think the conventional analysis on that is that the Conservative Party has been very, very skillful at adapting, very quick to adapt to changing situations, to changing demographic factors, to changing trends. I remember sitting there, I did the private polling for the Conservatives in 1997, and I used to say was then there through the first couple of years of the Blair government. And the question, which we were very clear in 1997, the question was, how long would it take for the Conservative Party to change enough in order to be presentable to the electorate, to something different enough to be electable again? And the answer turned out to be 3 election defeats. So that I think is the question. The question really is, assuming they do lose, and they seem, and I say I don't think they're going to be wiped out, but they'll probably lose fairly heavily. What do they do? What conclusion do they draw? How do they resolve that question of how much they need to change and in what direction? David Frum, Canadian-born, in the context of the Canadian conversation with an American commentator, always says that the natural habit of parties that lose is that if a party goes into an election promising ham and eggs and loses, its first impulse is to go back and say, okay, how about double ham and double eggs?
And Katie, when we're talking to MPs, Tory MPs right now, and they have got one, those who are still standing again, they have got an eye on what happens after the election. And all of the conversation is around sort of how much further to the right might they go under Suella Braverman, Kemi Badenoch, Robert Jenrick, rather than perhaps learning the lessons of previous elections that you win from the centre.
Yeah, so I think the Canadian example is interesting in the sense that obviously the Reform Party, which means that we don't even have to change it for the parallels in Canada, clearly did very well, had a social conservative platform which brought over lots of their supporters and ultimately pitched themselves as the real right-wing option, which you can see Reform in the UK doing now. But as we heard, they then end up, in total, the outcome of this was to have the right in Canada out for 13 years, but then there's a minority government, and 17 years before there's a majority again. But while they get different names, they do eventually join. So therefore, is the lesson, I know Reform has to change to a degree and it changes its name and moves in, but you do wonder too if perhaps what the Canadian example is telling us is that potentially all those potential Tory candidates who think that Reform should be brought closer, so that's Suella Braverman, that is, I don't think Liz Truss is a candidate, but you think about Popcorn, her outfit, she's trying to use that to shape the debate. Robert Jenrick would probably be in that camp. It does make you wonder if we're potentially heading to a place where they try and bring Reform, Nigel Farage, Lee Anderson, whatever position he is in out of the election, into it to make a broader Conservative Party. Now, you can argue it would not be broader because it'd be more to the right and you'd lose voters in the centre. But I don't think it's a clean-cut example of why you necessarily move one way. And I think in terms of, I think there is an argument that often elections are won from the centre. But I think that if Rishi Sunak loses this election badly, it will quickly be cited by figures in the party as a reason they have to move to the right, and they will try and say the problem was that they did not do enough of that. And that is why from, the beginning of the year, the Reform vote has been going up as David Cameron came back and Suella Braverman left.
So, Andrew, you've been there, with John Major in 97, with William Hague in 2001, but also with David Cameron, when he was in Downing Street. So what would be your advice to Rishi Sunak to make sure that the Conservatives don't disappear completely?
I think the Cameron experience is really interesting and is often forgotten. In the middle of the 2010-2015 Parliament, when I was working for David Cameron, people in the Conservative Party were freaking out because UKIP was surging in the polls. UKIP had got 3%, I think, from memory, in the 2010 election. They'd risen up into double figures. Most of that vote was coming from the Conservatives, not all of it, but more than half of it. And people were freaking out. One of the reasons that we ended up having a Brexit referendum was because the only thing the Tory party could think of that might stem the tide towards UKIP was to promise to have a referendum. Ironically, obviously, we did commit to a referendum, and we had a referendum. It didn't stem the flow of votes to UKIP, and UKIP ended up getting 13% of the vote in the 2015 general election, and the Conservative Party won a majority anyway, because David Cameron was able to build an electoral coalition that lent more to the centre and won the election by winning over a lot of people who had previously voted Liberal Democrat in particular. So leaders choose the shape of the political coalition they want, and Rishi Sunak has actually chosen to try to have a coalition which embraces more of those Reform UK-minded voters. He's chosen to try to have a coalition. He's explicitly said he would welcome Nigel Farage back into the Conservative Party family, but he's chosen to have a coalition tilted in that direction rather than a coalition the other way, which includes people like me.
And so would you, I know you backed, publicly backed the Lib Dems at the last election in 2019 over what was happening over Brexit. Would you back him, would you back Rishi Sunak at the next election?
So I got kicked out of the Conservative Party because I voted Liberal Democrat in the local elections.
That's right, sorry, yeah.
The Mental House rules, I don't have a vote in general election. If I did have a vote, I certainly wouldn't vote Conservative. If I had a vote, I would vote for whichever party was best placed to defeat the Conservatives where I live. Though where I live is a very, very safe Tory seat, and it probably wouldn't make any difference.
But it's interesting that for someone, it's not just been a Tory voter for a long time. You've worked for them in the highs and the lows, trying to get them into power, trying to keep them into power. How difficult is that decision then to vote, or to do anything you can to get them out?
Because I think the Conservative Party has lost entirely its sort of unifying purpose, and I think this is a perception that the electorate shares as well. It's very hard to make sense of what the Conservative Party believes in or stands for anymore. It seems to me to have dissolved into a series of unruly factions, each of which has a very different view of what the Conservative Party should be and how the Conservative Party could win. And it needs to resolve that question. I think it extraordinarily rapidly after the Brexit referendum, it basically turned into an English nationalist party, and its preoccupation with immigration has risen to the fore. Its obsession with Brexit, its now inability to accept the truth, which is self-evident to most people in this country, that Brexit was a mistake, has kind of trapped it. And the other there's a kind of structural problem they have as well, which is that the Get Brexit Done coalition that won them the big majority in 2019 is unstable in terms of economic issues, because it's the binding together of the traditional working class Labour bloc of voters who are pro-Brexit and a traditional conservative heartland which is pro-Brexit. And those two parts of their coalition have very different views on economic issues. So it's very hard to put forward an economic policy which holds that coalition together. And that's why they keep going back to cultural dividing lines to try to hold it together.
So you move away from the economics because you can't be a low tax, high spend party. So you move off to culture issues and talk about something else. It was absolutely fascinating and slightly alarming for the Conservatives. Andrew Cooper, Baron Cooper of Windrush, and Katie Balls, the Spectator's political editor. Thanks very much for joining us. And if you want to see more of the polling, just take a look at my account on social media, where you can have a look at that polling. It shows 22% want the Conservative Party to disappear completely. Only 14% of people want them to win the next general election.